In May of 2026, Donald Trump flew to Beijing for a 2-day summit with Xi Jinping. He didn't go alone. He brought with him what reporters at the time called one of the most extraordinary corporate delegations in the history of American diplomacy: Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, Tim Cook of Apple, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, Steven Schwartzman of Blackstone, David Solomon of Goldman Sachs, Jane Fraser of Citigroup, Kelly Ortberg of Boeing, and Larry Fink of BlackRock. When Trump introduced the group to Xi at the Great Hall of the People, he described them as distinguished representatives from the American business community, who all respect and value China. The group told Xi they highly value the Chinese market and hope to do more business there. Xi responded by welcoming more mutually beneficial cooperation and assured the room that American companies would have broader prospects in China. Pause on that scene for a moment, because the man who had spent the better part of a decade being investigated by Congress for investing American retirement savings into Chinese military-linked companies, being accused by 17 state attorneys general of misrepresenting China risk, being used by Beijing as a public advertisement for financial openness, and being squeezed between two governments who wanted opposite things from the same relationship. That man was now seated in the Great Hall of the People next to the President of the United States, being introduced to the President of China as a distinguished representative of American business, not despite his China relationship, because of it. The most contested financial position in the most contested geopolitical relationship in the modern world had somehow produced exactly the person that both Washington and Beijing wanted. In the room, at the moment they needed to talk to each other. That is the story almost nobody has told clearly, not because the pieces aren't visible. They are, scattered across congressional letters and SEC filings and state attorney general complaints and Xinhua broadcasts and regulatory announcements in Hong Kong, but because the conventional ways of telling this story force you to choose a lane. You either tell it as a scandal, Wall Street funding China's military at the expense of American retirees, or you tell it as globalization, a firm doing what firms do, following capital to where returns are highest, navigating sovereign regulatory environments like the multinational it is. Both of those framings capture something real. Neither of them captures what BlackRock actually became over the last decade, which is something that has no clean name in the existing vocabulary of either finance or geopolitics. A private institution so deeply embedded in both sides of the most consequential rivalry of our era that it stopped being simply a participant in that rivalry and started functioning as structural connective tissue between two systems that increasingly cannot communicate directly with each other. By the time this is over, you are going to understand exactly how one asset management firm got to that position, why both Beijing and Washington found it useful rather than threatening until they suddenly found it threatening, and why the contradiction at the center of BlackRock's existence in this rivalry is not a problem that either government has any real mechanism to solve. Stay with me, because the interesting part of this story is not the scandal version or the globalization version. It's the version where you follow the logic of how this actually happened and end up somewhere neither side of the debate wants to acknowledge. Let's start with what BlackRock is, because the answer to that question has changed considerably over the last 2 decades, and most people's mental model is about 10 years out of date. When most people picture BlackRock, they picture a large mutual fund company, something in the category of Vanguard or Fidelity, a place where you can open a retirement account and buy a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds. That picture is accurate as far as it goes, and it goes about a quarter of the way to describing what BlackRock actually is. As of 2025, BlackRock managed approximately $12.5 trillion in client assets. That number is larger than the annual economic output of every country on Earth, except the United States and China. It is more than the GDP of Japan, Germany, India, the United Kingdom, France, and Canada combined. The firm has 70 offices in 30 countries and clients in 100 countries. It is the single largest shareholder in more companies than you would ever be able to enumerate in a single conversation. But the asset management number, as staggering as it is, still isn't the whole picture. BlackRock also operates Aladdin, asset, liability, debt, and derivative investment network, a risk management and portfolio analytics platform that the firm built internally in the late 1980s and now licenses to more than 1,000 institutional clients globally. Those clients include CalPERS, the California Public Employees Pension Fund managing $260 billion, Deutsche Bank with around 900 billion euros under management, Prudential with around $700 billion, dozens of sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies, central banks, and asset managers around the world use Aladdin not as a supplementary tool, but as the foundational operating system through which they run their entire investment and risk management operations. By 2025, Aladdin's technology revenue alone had reached nearly $500 million per quarter. The UK's Financial Conduct Authority warned as early as 2021 that the failure of a system like Aladdin could cause serious consumer harm, or damage market integrity. The U, S, financial stability. Oversight Council had explored whether BlackRock should face enhanced regulatory scrutiny specifically because hundreds of major institutions were relying on the same underlying risk models, meaning that if Aladdin's signals moved markets, it could do so at a scale and simultaneity that no regulator had a framework for managing. This matters for understanding the US-China story because it means that when BlackRock makes decisions about how to classify Chinese assets, which Chinese companies to include in which indexes, what risk language to use in fund prospectuses when describing geopolitical exposure, and how to weight China in a globally diversified emerging market portfolio, those decisions do not just affect BlackRock's clients. They propagate through Aladdin into the portfolio management systems of hundreds of other major institutions. They influence how the world's institutional capital collectively perceives China as an investment environment. BlackRock does not just invest in China, it shapes the informational infrastructure through which much of the Western financial world thinks about China. Now here is where the US-China dimension of this story begins, because China understood that dynamic before most people in Washington did. The sequence of regulatory approvals Beijing handed BlackRock between 2016 and 2021 has been covered in detail elsewhere, and the pattern is worth understanding as a whole rather than as a list of individual milestones. In December 2016, BlackRock became the first American-based asset manager to receive RQFII status, a license allowing it to invest directly into mainland Chinese stocks and bonds from inside the United States. In 2017, it secured a private fund management registration, allowing it to launch onshore investment funds for Chinese wealthy individuals and institutions. In 2019, an investment advisory license followed. In 2020, on literally the first day Chinese regulators permitted it, BlackRock applied to become the first wholly foreign-owned company allowed to run a retail mutual fund business inside mainland China, selling investment products directly to ordinary Chinese citizens. And in 2021, a joint venture with China Construction Bank and Singapore's Temasek, BlackRock's CCB Wealth Management, was approved with BlackRock holding 50.1%, just enough for control, and immediately began piloting pension wealth management products in major Chinese cities. None of those approvals went to Vanguard, which chose to scale back its own ambitions inside China rather than expand them. None went to Fidelity, which trailed BlackRock's timeline by roughly a year on its key application. None went to State Street, which pursued narrower institutional mandates. Beijing selected BlackRock, specifically and repeatedly, as its designated a test case for Western financial engagement with Chinese markets. And the reason it did comes back to the Aladdin point. No other institution's decision to be visibly, expansively present inside Chinese capital markets would send a more powerful signal to the rest of the world's institutional capital than BlackRock's. When the firm, whose risk platform sits underneath hundreds of major institutional investors' own portfolio operations, decides that China is investable enough to build a full-scale retail and pension business there, that is not just one firm's judgment. That is, functionally, an industry-wide credibility signal. Beijing was not buying BlackRock's investment management expertise. It has that domestically. Beijing was buying the endorsement that BlackRock's presence represented, the most powerful third-party validation of Chinese capital market credibility available anywhere in the Western financial system. And it was doing so at a moment when foreign direct investment into China was still growing, when confidence in the Chinese growth story was still high, and when the long-term logic of integrating China into global capital markets seemed, to most observers, like an inevitable direction of travel rather than a contested geopolitical choice. Then 2022 happened, and 2023. And the picture began changing in ways that neither Beijing nor BlackRock had fully anticipated. Between 2021 and 2024, China's net foreign direct investment position swung from a surplus of $334 billion to a deficit of $154 billion. Foreign institutional investors, who were supposed to be the most patient money in the world, pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, had largely redirected capital away from Chinese equities by late 2023, citing regulatory unpredictability, the property sector collapse, and the growing fear that US-China tensions had moved beyond trade friction into something more structural and permanent. A Bank of America survey of 182 institutional fund managers published in early 2025 found that only 10% were optimistic about Chinese economic growth, down from 61% just 3 months earlier. The story of China as an opening, modernizing, inevitably integrating economy had not exactly broken, but it had cracked in ways that no amount of official reassurance could fully repair. And through all of that, BlackRock kept showing up in Beijing. December 2024, Larry Fink meeting with Vice Premier He Lifeng, broadcast by Xinhua in the language Beijing reserves for moments it wants the world to notice. the firm continuing to manage its joint venture with China Construction Bank, continuing to hold positions across Chinese equities and bonds inside its emerging market funds, continuing to maintain the onshore presence that no other Western asset manager had built to anything close to the same depth or breadth, which is precisely when the pressure from the other direction started compounding. In August of 2023, the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party opened a formal investigation into BlackRock and MSCI, finding that 5 BlackRock funds had directed more than $429 million into 20 Chinese companies that the U.S. government had placed on its own blacklists for national security, human rights, and military-linked concerns. A separate policy research report found BlackRock funds holding approximately $200 million in companies tied to nuclear warhead production, including roughly $46 million in China, National Nuclear Power Corporation, a firm building the fast breeder reactor technology that produces plutonium for nuclear weapons, and close to $130 million across companies on the Treasury Department's own Chinese military-industrial complex list. BlackRock's consistent response was the same sentence it has repeated in every iteration of this scrutiny: full compliance with all applicable United States law. That answer is, in the narrowest legal sense, accurate. It is also, in a broader sense, the most carefully crafted non-engagement with the actual question that a legal team could produce. In February of 2025, 17 Republican state attorneys general formally accused BlackRock of materially misrepresenting China risk in its fund disclosures, using language that described tensions with unnamed Asia-Pacific issuers rather than explicitly naming China as a designated foreign adversary under U.S. law, which it has been since March 2023. The attorneys general argued that ordinary retirement savers were not being told, in language they could understand and act on, that some portion of their pension contributions was flowing toward companies the U.S. Treasury had formally identified as supporting a foreign military. Sit with that last sentence for a moment, because this is where the abstract financial machinery becomes very concrete. More than 2,000 American mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, according to Bloomberg data, collectively hold close to $294 billion in Chinese stocks and bonds. Much of that is concentrated in the kind of passive index tracking products that millions of retirement savers hold without ever actively selecting China exposure. A nurse contributing to a hospital pension, a public school administrator whose 401k defaults into a broadly diversified international index, a firefighter whose state pension is managed by an external firm using an index that includes Chinese A shares, because the index methodology says their market capitalization justifies inclusion. None of those people chose China. None of them saw a choice point. They chose a fund that chose an index that chose to include Chinese assets because that is what passive investing at scale is designed to do: eliminate active selection decisions, minimize fees, and trust diversification. That model was never designed to account for the possibility that one of the world's 2 largest economies might be simultaneously the world's most significant geopolitical adversary of the country whose retirement savings are flowing into it. BlackRock is not the only firm in that picture, but it is the largest, the most structurally embedded, the one with a joint venture inside China's domestic banking system, the one whose CEO is walking into Beijing meetings that get broadcast on state television, and the one that keeps ending up at the center of every fresh round of congressional letters and attorney general complaints and watchdog reports, regardless of how carefully its legal team drafts the compliance language. Now here is the part of the story that becomes genuinely strange when you pull back far enough to see the whole picture. In March of 2025, a BlackRock-led consortium announced a $22.8 billion deal to acquire 43 ports in 23 countries from CK Hutchison, the Hong Kong conglomerate controlled by Li Ka-shing. The crown jewels were the ports at Balboa and Cristobal, on either side of the Panama Canal, the waterway through which roughly 3% of all global seaborne trade flows. For Washington, which had been pushing to reduce Chinese influence over global maritime infrastructure since Trump's inauguration address in January, this was a strategic prize. Larry Fink personally spearheaded the deal. The White House celebrated it. Beijing's response was immediate, coordinated, and effective. The State Administration for Market Regulation announced an antitrust review of CK Hutchison's operations. Pro-Beijing newspaper Ta Kung Pao published an editorial calling the proposed sale a betrayal of all Chinese people and warning that the consequences will be very serious. Chinese officials issued directives to state-owned enterprises to halt new business with CK Hutchison affiliates. Then, in December 2025, Beijing escalated. Chinese officials told the Wall Street Journal directly that control of the canal's ports would be made a formal negotiating point in U.S.-China trade talks. Beijing demanded that state-owned shipping giant Costco receive a controlling stake in any future sale. The White House responded that Chinese control of the Panama Canal is unacceptable. CK Hutchison's exclusivity window with the BlackRock consortium expired in late July 2025. By February 2026, Panama had voided C.K. Hutchison's port concessions entirely and handed interim operations to Maersk and MSC under a court ruling, with the underlying geopolitical dispute still unresolved. The deal that Washington had framed as a strategic win against Chinese infrastructure influence had, through Beijing's regulatory pressure on a Hong Kong private company whose assets sat in Central America, been redirected into an outcome that neither side fully controlled. It and BlackRock, the firm that Washington had used as its chosen instrument for reducing Chinese influence over a major global choke point, was caught directly in the crossfire of the same rivalry it had spent a decade positioning itself to bridge. That contradiction is the most clarifying thing in the entire story, because it reveals, with unusual precision, what the bridge metaphor actually means in practice. A bridge connects two sides. It is, by definition, accessible from both ends. The structural features that make it useful for crossing, the fact that it spans the distance, that it is embedded in both banks, that it cannot be easily pulled to one side without collapsing, are the same features that make it the first thing targeted when the two banks stop wanting traffic to move between them. BlackRock's decade of deliberate positioning as the Western financial institution most deeply integrated into Chinese capital markets made it the most valuable single asset Washington could use when it wanted to conduct financial engagement with China. It made it the most valuable signal Beijing could use when it wanted to demonstrate to the world that its markets remained open. And it made it the most exposed single institution when both sides simultaneously decided that the terms of engagement needed to change, that China was a foreign adversary, not just a market, and that the flow of Western capital into Chinese military-linked companies was a strategic liability, not just a portfolio allocation. The question that sits underneath all of this, and that nobody in any official position in either Washington or Beijing has shown any appetite for answering in plain language, is whether the bridge is still functional when both sides of the river are actively trying to reduce traffic across it. From BlackRock's own position, the answer it has offered consistently is that it is a financial institution, not a foreign policy actor, and that its obligation runs to its clients and their financial returns, not to the geopolitical preferences of any government. That answer is coherent on its own terms. Fiduciary duty is a real legal obligation. The financial case for China exposure, while contested on geopolitical grounds, is not commercially trivial. China represents one of the largest pools of retail and institutional savings on the planet, and being first through its regulatory doors by years ahead of every competitor is a structural advantage with genuine long-term commercial value. Walking away from all of it in response to political pressure from Washington would itself be a decision with real financial consequences for the clients whose money BlackRock manages, but coherent and sufficient are different things. The fiduciary defense explains why BlackRock has not voluntarily reduced its Chinese exposure to zero. It does not explain why the firm has managed for nearly a decade to be simultaneously welcomed at the highest levels of both governments, treated by Beijing as a trusted financial partner, treated by Washington as a diplomatic asset, even as 17 state attorneys general were simultaneously accusing it of deceiving American retirement savers about the risks of the same Chinese positions that were making it useful to both governments. That simultaneity is not an accident. It is the product of a position deliberately and carefully constructed. And it is the position that put Larry Fink on Air Force One to Beijing in May 2026, seated next to Elon Musk and Tim Cook, being introduced to Xi Jinping as a distinguished representative of American business, not by accident, because the Trump administration understood, in the most practical possible terms, that the firms most deeply enmeshed in the Chinese economy were the firms best positioned to extract value from a summit with the Chinese government, and that BlackRock's decade of Chinese market access was itself a form of diplomatic leverage that Washington was now prepared to use rather than simply criticize. That is the resolution, or more precisely, the absence of resolution, that this entire story arrives at. The same exposure that Congress investigated, the same positions that state attorneys general accused of deceiving pensioners, the same joint venture with a state-owned Chinese bank that critics said was quietly underwriting Beijing's financial credibility. It all became, at the right moment, an asset, not a liability, in the hands of a government that had spent 5 years criticizing it and then decided, pragmatically, that it was more useful as a tool than as a target. For ordinary savers who never chose any of this, who contributed to pension funds and 401k accounts and target date retirement products, and ended up, through 3 layers of institutional abstraction they were never asked to navigate, holding fractional stakes in Chinese companies on U.S. government watch lists. The picture is considerably less resolved. They are still holding the exposure. The congressional letters are still being written. The Attorney General complaints are still being argued. The prospectus language is still being debated. And the underlying question of who is actually responsible for the gap between what ordinary American savers thought they owned and what they actually own has not been answered by any government, any regulator, or any court in the years since this story began accumulating its current shape. Here's what I want you to sit with, because I think it is the most honest framing of what this story actually is at its deepest level. BlackRock did not become a bridge between two rival superpowers because it set out to be one. It became a bridge because it made a series of deliberate, commercially rational decisions that, compounded over a decade, produced a position so embedded in both systems that neither system could easily function without it, and so exposed to both systems' conflicts that neither system could fully protect it either. The question of whether that position makes BlackRock a strategic asset or a strategic liability depends entirely on which government you're asking and which week you're asking. In February of 2025, it was a liability Washington criticized and Beijing relied on. In May of 2026, it was an asset Washington deployed and Beijing cautiously welcomed. What it has never been, in any of those iterations, is something the ordinary people whose money sits inside it were ever clearly told was happening. And whether that gap between what millions of ordinary savers own and what they were told they own is BlackRock's responsibility to close, Washington's responsibility to legislate, or each individual investor's responsibility to discover by reading a prospectus nobody ever opens. That question is still sitting exactly where it was when this story started, unanswered, accumulating, and quietly, invisibly present in every target date retirement fund that defaults into global market exposure without ever asking the person contributing to it what they think about the relationship between the world's two most powerful countries. Tell me where you land in the comments, because I think the honest answer depends on what you believe the purpose of financial disclosure is actually for the firm that offers it, the regulator that requires it, or the person who was never quite told enough to know what to ask. And if you want to keep following this story as it continues unfolding in congressional hearings, regulatory filings, and diplomatic summits that involve the same cast of institutions every time, subscribe, because we are absolutely nowhere near the end of it.